So this is the second video of the Soviet Union and Fascism. And what we're concerned with here is whether or not the USSR was indeed on its way to becoming a communist nation. Remember, our Marxist steps are, first of all, uh, educate the masses, then overthrow the government, then get rid of enemies of the state, including the bourgeoisie, and then society would evolve into a classless society. So we're wondering, is the Soviet Union on its way to becoming a communist nation in the 1920s and 30s, or was it simply a fascist nation? You could pause and take a look at this painting done in 1920 about the communist revolution and notice this Bolshevik man, characterized as a giant among other people. Does he look like a fascist symbol or a communist symbol? So let's take a look at the early economics of the USSR. I mentioned in the last video lecture that the Soviets were basically expanding, and they were expanding because they said that they wanted the political revolution to become a worldwide revolution. But another way to think of this expansion was as imperialism. In communism, you have to share all resources, and so you can't just acquire resources through trade. What you really have to do is you have to just exploit the lands to get resources. So countries like Ukraine, which is the blue country, number 14, or Kazakhstan, which is the purple country, number 6, were technically supposed to be independent republics, but they came under Soviet rule and were basically imperial colonies of the USSR. Now, let's take a look at the first forms of the economy in the USSR. The first was war communism, and this was basically run by Lenin, and it was the earliest economic model, and its sole focus was to supply the war effort during the Civil War. Remember, the Reds were fighting the Whites in order to establish a supposedly communist nation. During war communism, all land that the Reds could get their hands on was seized and used for the war effort, which led to a terrible famine in which between 5 and 6 million Russians and Ukrainians died. Again, they were not using the food to eat, they were using the food to supply soldiers or to trade in order to get arms. So war communism, to put it bluntly, didn't work. Instead, in 1921, towards the end of the Civil War, Lenin enacts a new policy called the New Economic Policy. This was the first of what would become many 5-year plans. Basically, it had an end goal in mind, and the idea was that the economy would shift when that goal had been reached. So the goal here was to get enough money to industrialize so that the Soviet Union could basically be self-sufficient and create things on its own. So in order to do that, Lenin decided that they had to become a little capitalist so that they could become communist later. This meant giving private individuals land holdings and businesses so that they could work and try and sell their products to foreign companies and get capital, which then they could use to reinvest in industrial infrastructure. To put it shortly, they had to become capitalist for a short period of time so that they could make more money. This went on for about 5 years. It got the Soviet economy back on track. The USSR developed lots of factories during this time. The USSR was able to kind of get its farming back on track so that people were a little bit better off by 1926. Now, enter Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin began as an enforcer for the Russian Revolution. He was known as a pretty tough guy, kind of a guy you don't want to mess with. He became the general secretary in 1922. Now, in 1924, Lenin died from an aneurysm. Basically, he worked too hard, and he died early. And he left kind of a power vacuum. People didn't really know who was going to become the head of government after Lenin. Remember, there's not really supposed to be a head of government. There's just supposed to be somebody who's going to, well, I don't know. That was kind of a problem. Basically, the idea was that somebody would work in the best interest of the people as the head of government until the people could become a classless society. So, after a power struggle between Stalin and a guy named Leon Trotsky, who you could study a little bit more. He's a very interesting fellow. Uh, Trotsky was an architect of the Russian Revolution and a good friend of Lenin, but Stalin eventually beat him out for the job, basically because nobody wanted to mess with Stalin. And Stalin had a reputation and a nasty habit for his enemies to basically disappear. So Stalin was known as the kind of guy you didn't want to mess with because you might end up dead. So Stalin became the head of the Communist Party in about 1927. And Stalin created a series of, or at least updated a series of new economic plans. First of all, he had his own 5-year plans with their own goals. Stalin's 5-year plans were a lot more harsh. They involved forcibly making the people do work. So whole regions of the USSR were put to work doing various industries, whether factories or mines or whatever it was. The idea was that you were working for the good of the communist nation, and your work you would receive due compensation for your work because you would share in the wealth that you produced. Now, this 5-year plan was accompanied by collectivization, which basically meant that the state owned everything, including the food that you worked for. All of your food, all of your mining, all of your factory work, all of that was seized by the government and either redistributed to the rest of the people, or it was sold to foreign nations for capital so that they could use that money to reinvest in new industrial resources. And probably the most brutal system that Stalin had was the Gulag system. Their motto was "Work will set you free." And the basic idea was that any enemy of the state or suspected enemy of the state was sent to these prison camps where they worked, and they worked until their sentence was up or until they died. Lots of people died in these systems. It was such an efficient and basically productive system that the Nazis would eventually send SS to the USSR in the 1930s to see how these ran, because the Nazis would use these gulags as the inspiration and the model for their own concentration camps that would put 6 million Jews to death. So Stalin, although the Soviet Union did produce a lot of factories and produced a lot of grain during this time, it was at a huge cost to the Soviet people. One of these major costs was famine. Because grain was collectively seized and sent to all parts of the USSR, very often people didn't get enough to eat. Between 5 and 10 million people died between 1932 and 1933, and they died of starvation, which is a pretty terrible way to die. The Soviets said that they died because of a harsh winter, but really they died because peasants were not allowed to eat their own food. That was considered theft of government property. And Soviet officials could take however much they wanted, and very often they took too much. Also, the peasants couldn't leave their land because the only people who could get passports were government officials. So peasants were stuck in areas and they starved. Probably the worst example of this, and maybe one of the worst examples of genocide in all of human history, was something called the Holodomor. And this was as many historians believe, a deliberate starvation campaign against Ukrainians by the Soviets. About 5 million tons of cereal grain were taken from the Ukraine, which means farmers produced a bunch of Ukraine, which was taken and then sold to other nations. Meanwhile, during that year, almost 7.5 million Ukrainians died of starvation. Half of those were kids. Now, this followed actually the execution of Ukrainian elites, people like scientists, teachers, writers, people who advocated for Ukrainian nationalism. Remember, Ukraine was under basically imperial rule by the USSR. Today, 14 countries across the world recognize the Holodomor as ethnic genocide, deliberate mass murder of millions of people. Now, for our final bit, let's take a look at Stalin's methods of control of the population and see if it resembles fascism or communism. First of all, state surveillance. The USSR had secret police who closely monitored the population to make sure they weren't doing anything to classify them as an enemy of the state. Basically, anybody suspected of being an enemy of the state was sent to a gulag or executed on the spot. Um, there was mass propaganda. So propaganda was used to promote Soviet ideology. The state controlled the media. Um, there was no free press. The only messages that were sent out to the public were messages that the Soviet regime wanted sent out. And meanwhile, the Soviets developed something known as a cult of personality, which you first learned about with Mussolini. Towns and buildings and factory, everything was named after Stalin. Stalingrad, which is, you'll learn about in World War II, was a city built around oil that was named after Stalin. Everywhere you walked, there were posters of him, holidays. So the idea was Stalin is the leader and the father of this communist nation. There are also purges, which basically were mass murders of people who opposed the state. Anyone who even had a job that closely resembled something that might oppose the state were very often murdered. Writers, scientists, landowners, clergy, artists, teachers, students, protesters, they were executed or imprisoned in labor camps. Just for some context, 1 million people were exiled, meaning they were forcibly removed from the two biggest cities in Russia, Moscow and Leningrad, in 1 year. And in 2 years, the Great Terror, about 1 million people were executed, and as many as 6 million people were sent to labor camps. Religious persecution. Russia had a long history of being an Eastern Orthodox nation, but the USSR considered religion a threat to the state because it advocated for things that might oppose the state, things like mercy, right, or worshiping something besides the communist state. So, for instance, during the Great Terror, as many as 100,000 clergy were executed by gunfire. That's about a quarter of the population of Oakland murdered by gunfire in a year. These are priests. Here's a picture of the destruction of one of Moscow's most famous Russian Orthodox churches in 1931. So, pause this video lecture. Take a look at the definitions of fascism. Was the USSR more fascist, or was it on its way to becoming communist? Just as a final concluding thought, here are two propaganda posters from roughly the same areas. The left is the Nazis. The right is propaganda of Joseph Stalin for the USSR. Okay? So, in conclusion, we need to think about whether or not communism, first of all, can exist. Second of all, was the USSR communist? And third of all, if it was going to be communist, is the death of approximately 20 million people, all told, a necessary step towards achieving communism? Okay?